This presentation is about tracking and understanding Bigg's killer whales from California to Alaska. And I conduct this work and have been for several years now, not only on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but also Bay Cetology, who manages a lot of the tracking of this population throughout its range from California to Alaska. My personal background, though, has been such that I've spent a lot of time with killer whales. I'm here tonight in Alert Bay, British Columbia, Canada, traditional territory of the Noongees First Nation, and also known as home of the killer whale, because we just happen to be situated in a place where there's a great habitat for orcas. As a kid, I spent a lot of my time on this whale watch boat in the background, which was owned by my parents at the time. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, we'd be on the water all day with northern resident killer whales. And occasionally we'd see bigs as well. But nowadays, fast forward to the present, and I spend a lot of time in this boat. This is a boat that I work up and down the coast of British Columbia in, looking for killer whales and responding to reports of them to track and use this data to better understand them in many different ways. So a lot of this is really underpinned by photo identification, and this is something I bring up in several presentations I've done. So if you've seen me present before, there's a good chance you've seen a few of these slides, but I think it's really important to cover, especially for this topic, because it is such a broad topic. And photo ID really underpins so much of what we know about these whales. Back in the 1960s and throughout some of the early 1970s, you may know that killer whales were being captured in Washington and British Columbia. And it really raised the question of how many there were, especially if they're all ending up in marine parks. Can the population sustain it? So, at least in Canada, Fisheries and Oceans was confronted with this issue and tasked Dr. Michael Bigg with this problem. And back then, there wasn't a really clear idea of how you might go about counting killer whales. And Mike came out with this outrageous idea to photo identify them. And we really take that for granted now, thinking that, of course, you would want to photo identify them. But back then, so I'm told, it was preposterous. And Mike and his colleagues, like Graham Ellis here, received a lot of pushback from other scientists because at that time, you have to remember that not a lot of people anywhere in the world were doing field studies on wild, live animals. A lot of the science was conducted on dead individuals. And so to actually conduct a field study on live whales without taking any, especially using this new technology of photo ID, seemed a bit strange. But in the end, here we are almost 7 years later, still doing it with, of course, digital technology and not film. So just to show you an example of how well it works for killer whales, here's T23, 42 years apart. As you can see, she's hardly changed at all. And photo ID, of course, gives us an idea of the distribution of individuals. These are all the encounters between when T23 was first photographed in the 1970s and 2018. And you can see that her and her family spend a lot of time in the coastal waters of British Columbia and also Southeast Alaska. And through photo identification efforts over time, we've been able to track the existence of her offspring, including her grandchildren. So back in the early days of photo ID, the technology was okay, but not super good. It's mostly the dorsal fins that were used to track individuals. Got a little bit better, started including saddle patches throughout the 1990s and had more images to choose from to select the best ones. And of course, now we've taken it so far that we have life history data for so many of these individuals, hundreds and hundreds of them. And we're able to make these nice photo ID catalogs once or twice a decade, which we include eye patches in. And this helps us track individuals over time as researchers, as whale watchers, as members of the general public. It seems that a lot of people find this kind of information really useful. And it's also useful for identifying populations. So the population we'll mostly be talking about tonight is the West Coast Transient population of the Bigg's killer whale subspecies or ecotype. And they range from the coastal waters of Southeast Alaska right down to Southern California. It's quite possible that they go a bit further south, especially offshore, but we don't know exactly how far offshore this population ranges. To the north, there's several populations of Bigg's killer whales in Alaska, especially Western Alaska, but at least in central and kind of southeastern Alaska, the West Coast Transient killer whales overlap with the Gulf of Alaska transients, at least one population. There's another population called the AT1s up in Prince William Sound. And as I said, out in Western Alaska, there's several different genetic stocks of Bigg's killer whales. We threw Eastern tropical Pacific killer whales in here, not because they're of the Bigg's ecotype, but because they're also mammal eaters. So these are the mammal eating populations that range up and down the west coast of North America. And we really know who these whales are first and foremost from photo ID, because when you do a social analysis, you find that they fall into these distinct clusters. But that can also be assigned to these populations can be assigned to haplotypes, which is an indication of their genetic evolution. So all this photo ID data isn't just a matter of looking at photos, unfortunately. It's a matter of annotating them. And this might be a bit boring to hear about, but I'm saying this because it's such an important and time-consuming part of the work that we do. We actually apply ID metadata to every single photo so that these data can be queried very easily at any time in the future. And we also make sure that all the data from encounters gets put into an encounter database with the date, the location, photographer, lat long, and all the individuals that were photo ID'd. And at this point, we actually have over 10,000 encounters in the Bigg's killer whale photo ID database, which is, it probably makes it one of the largest cetacean photo ID data sets on the planet. And all these data, of course, go into a registry as well for every individual, which has all of its life history information, including its old BC ID, its Alaska ID, its current ID, nicknames, birth year, et cetera, et cetera. So because there's so much work associated with photo ID workflow processing, it has been a dream of mine to expedite this entire process by utilizing existing technology. And so this is where automation and artificial intelligence come in. One thing that we've spent a lot of time and a lot of resources invested in over the last 3 to 4 years is building models to help expedite the process of killer whale photo ID workflow that can be applied to other species as well, but also building out this platform called finwave.io. So if you're familiar with Finwave, great. If not, you can go to finwave.io and check it out. This is a homepage. It's all about streamlining the identification process. And if you go to the Bigg's killer whale page on Finwave, you can see that this work is made possible by Bay Cetology, of course, and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but also FAU, Friedrich Alexander University in Germany, who we've collaborated with to make it possible. Oceanwise, the North Island Marine Mammal Stewardship Association, and Eagle Wing Tours. And we've also got a lot of support from our contributors. We just hit the 1,000 contributor mark recently. We have 725 unique individuals photo identified on the platform, well over 250,000 images, and over 430,000 AI fin detections, and over 250,000 predicted identifications. So that might not sound too meaningful at the moment, but I'll walk you through some of this. Uh, what happens if you have photos of Bigg's killer whales you want to submit to this data set? You just go to the submit page and put in your date or your location, drop your images in, and then hit submit. And they end up in this encounters folder, which any contributor can access to see, who's been seeing whom where. And you can also search for individuals and, date ranges, locations. You can keep track of all your own data this way, or see what other people have been seeing in different parts of the coast. And we have little codes to show whether there were predation events or not, whether or not these data can be used for like under a Creative Commons license, or whether or not the photographer has to be contacted before they're used for any scientific study, for example. We've also got a lot of that automated in our latest version of FinWave, where you can request data exports. And then you can do this if you're a student and you want to use some of these data for your thesis or whatever the case may be. The idea is that these whales don't belong to anybody, and the data can be used to do a lot of good work to better understand them. So that's kind of the point of FinWave. We process a lot of the encounters. You can see that the distribution of encounters for the last 500 at least have shown that there's a few down here in the Monterey Bay area. There's a lot around southern Vancouver Island. There's a few up in Alaska, some in Haida, and not many off the west coast of Oregon, but hopefully we'll continue to get more from that area in the future. And then, of course, the ID work comes in, and this is where my team of administrators is confronted with all these images, and the model instantaneously has predictions for every single dorsal fin. In this case, it's accurately predicting T36B1, which isn't too hard because it's a very distinct individual. But it's also saying that this rhinoceros auklet is an unknown object, which is great because it is, at least as far as this model is concerned. So we go in and confirm or correct the model suggestions. It works great for images which contain more than one individual killer whale, in this case, correctly identifying both siblings in this match line called the T109Bs. Or even this photo that I recently took of the T36Bs and the T99s all traveling together. And these are very common individuals, so the model does a very good job at predicting who they are just by looking at these photos of them. So that's a lot of what the ID work does. It doesn't take the work out of the photo ID process, but it automates it. And some of our work developing these models we published in some decent journals lately, which we're quite happy about. The first one was in 2021, and that was specifically for killer whales. But our latest version of this model has been applied to bottlenose dolphins, minke whales, even humpback whale dorsal fins with high accuracy. And so, FinWave is available for anybody who wants to use this technology to manage their photo ID data sets. Um, all these data, the beauty of the program, at least insofar as I'm concerned, is that it automates a lot of the things that we used to do manually, like building out photo ID catalogs, using folders of individuals. Now we just have all of this data analyzed, is automatically put into the database. So all the encounters associated with T2B are assigned to T2B's profile. So if you click on T2B, you can see the best right and left side photos selected for her, how old she is, when she was born, where she's being seen, who she hangs out with, when the last sighting was, all these kinds of things. So really a comprehensive, one-stop shop for your Bigg's killer whales and several other populations which are on board at the moment. So one thing we've got coming down the pipe is both FinWave Pro and FinWave Lite. These we hope will be released sometime in the next few months. FinWave Pro is specifically for population administrators, so other researchers who have their own data sets, and you might want advanced statistics or advanced analysis and tools, like just automatically applying a social matrix to your data set or looking at these different modules for who's been most recently seen or who was last seen, which individuals have the longest distance travel records in recent times, which export requests are pending, recent comments, and all these kinds of things. FinWave Lite, on the other hand, will basically be the field version of FinWave. So you want your catalog, you want the individual profiles, and maybe there's a couple individuals you want to be notified about anytime they show up, stuff like that. And so that's what we're hoping to release sometime in the near future, which is kind of exciting for us. But part of the reason we do all this work, you might be asking, is like, why is this useful? You probably know, but photo ID is really useful for identifying not only populations, but also the abundance of populations. So if you look at this big graph, you can see that since this work has been conducted fairly regularly in the early 1970s, that not only has the unique number of Bigg's killer whales identified each year grown, which is probably not surprising, but the number of data contributors and the number of encounters has also grown. And so you'll see a couple interesting trends here. Throughout the early to mid and late 2000s, you can see that the number of data contributors and the number of encounters really skyrocketed. And that's because during that decade, there was a big switch from film to digital, which meant that a lot of people, a lot more people were photo IDing whales, and a lot more people were sending their data in because it was much easier. Back in the film days, we'd wait 2 weeks to get our film back, and we'd be mailing it to each other using the postal service. Anyways, that was all finished by the end of the 2000s. You can also see a jump very recently in the number of encounters, and that's since 2023, 2024. This is because we launched FinWave in 2023. And so you can see that that has also coincided with a larger number of individual Bigg's killer whales identified each year, which is exactly what we want. We want to try and census as many of these individuals as possible, just like we do with southern residents and northern residents. There's an active effort to go out and photograph every individual every year so we can have high resolution data on the abundance and health of these populations. So this is currently in press, as is this as well. So one of the things that we've done, at least for Bigg's killer whales from the West Coast Transient killer whale population, which have been identified in BC, and I should mention that BC is really the heartland of a lot of whales in this population. It's central to their overall range. So even most of the killer whales that spend most of their time in California, down in Monterey Bay, or even off of Los Angeles or further north up along the coast, almost all those whales have been photo identified in BC before. And a lot of the whales that almost never leave southeastern Alaska, they've also been photo identified in BC. And a bunch of the whales that like to hang out in BC have been photo identified in California and Alaska as well. So BC is really central to this range of this population, so that you can see in this graph in British Columbia, this gray line indicates the overall number of killer whales of this ecotype that have been photo identified over the years. But what we've done to have a better understanding of the core group of this population, these are the whales that get seen repeatedly year after year. We've called this group the coastal subset. And how we defined it was by taking the number of mature individuals in about 1994, 1995, and just saying, okay, these are the ones that we see regularly over time. And those mature individuals get classified as a coastal subset. And by then retrospectively looking at growth, which is due to the reproduction associated with those whales, we can see that this coastal subset has grown at about 2.9% per year on average between 1994 and 2024. So this highlights that even though the number of individuals, new individuals, is basically only reflective of calves being born, whereas this gray line includes all calves as well as individuals that are mature when they're photo identified for the first time, which doesn't happen very often, but does sometimes happen, especially in more remote parts of the coast. So hopefully that's a good explanation for this graph. And this kind of begs the question of, well, if this population is continuing to grow, the coastal subset at least, and this is probably representative of the overall West Coast transient killer whale population, then what is carrying capacity? When is this population going to reach it or overshoot it? And carrying capacity can be defined as basically the number of individuals in a population that the ecosystem can support. And it's often represented as K in science circles. So what often happens is a population might overshoot it and then decline and then slowly stabilize. And so this is heavily reliant on the availability of prey. So when we look at the prey of West Coast transient killer whales, what we find is that they love to eat harbor seals in BC. Bigg's killer whales, most of the time, are just killing harbor seals when you see them. And if you look at British Columbia coastwide, you'll see that the harbor seals basically surpassed carrying capacity in about 2000, and since then have been on a bit of a downward trend as they stabilize. And so that might be an indication that we could expect the same for Bigg's killer whales because they eat so many of them. And that BC coastwide plot is the one just on the bottom on the right-hand side. And so that's a good indication of the entire population in the province. Now, in California, the most hot item for prey for this population is California sea lion. Most of the encounters where these whales are feeding on something or killing something is California sea lions. And they have also reached carrying capacity in the US in about 2010. And so that again might tell you that we should expect the population growth of this population of killer whales to start slowing down. When we look at the second most commonly eaten prey of this population in British Columbia, we think of harbor porpoises. And they're increasing in density, at least in Washington and probably throughout southern British Columbia as well. While Dall's porpoises, at least in the Salish Sea, are declining in density, which probably means that they're declining in abundance. However, throughout the rest of BC, they seem to be pretty stable. So that's partly responsible for the continued growth of the big killer whale population. In California, the second most common prey item is gray whale calves. And this is a population that's been declining recently. So you can see that it was somewhat stable, increasing throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, and kind of leveled off and declined a bit through the 90s. Came back up again in the late 2010s, and then since then, there's been this unusual mortality event that has been going on for several years, and the population has almost dropped in half, which is probably not good for the orcas that rely on feeding on these babies. Uh, Third most common prey item in BC, stellar sea lions. And at least up until 2017, 2018, this population was still growing. And this actually is something that I think we're seeing more of in BC. Uh, I'd say that it's almost even with harbor porpoise predation, stellar sea lion predation, and they may be taking advantage of it because they are continuing to grow at such a strong rate. And finally, the third most common prey item in California for this population is the elephant seal. And just like stellar sea lions, they continue to grow, which is good news. And at some point, these stellar sea lions and these elephant seals are going to reach carrying capacity, and perhaps after that point, these West Coast transients will do the same. So the status of this population in Canada is threatened. And it's threatened because it's a relatively small population that eats relatively toxic prey. In the US, this population has no special protection under the Endangered Species Act. And it's not to say they're not at risk. It's just that, different countries have different ways of categorizing these things. For example, in Canada, our sperm whales are not listed as threatened or endangered, but in the US, they're listed as endangered. But these are the same whales. They just cross over the border into Canada, not endangered. They go back into the US and they are. So it's kind of the same for this population of killer whales. But because, at least in Canada, where I work and where I'm from, they are listed as threatened, this means that the government has a mandate to understand and protect them. And so it means that, yeah, we do try and do an annual census of the core group of this population. And thankfully, well, it depends how you look at it, but at least for our sake, it's fairly easy to go out and find Bigg's killer whales. They spend a lot of time around urban centers. This is taken out front in Nanaimo. They'll go into Vancouver Harbor. They'll swim right into Victoria Harbor. They can be seen from Seattle. I know that you can go out from Los Angeles or that area and find them. Obviously, Monterey Bay. I've seen them myself north of San Francisco. So they get around, and obviously they're not afraid of people. You can see them from a mile away, and they can be quite engaging. Um, they do feed on marine mammals, as you know, and part of the problem with this is that they're feeding so high up the food chain that they're bioaccumulating prey at higher rates than any other killer whale populations in the Pacific Ocean. And when you compare them to northern residents or southern residents, they're more contaminated by all sex and age classes of Biggs are more contaminated than any sex and age class of northern residents or southern residents. And this was true throughout the 1990s, and it was true throughout the 2010s as well. So it's not an issue that is going away. Maybe at some point it will, but that is far into the future. And this is because their prey are also fairly contaminated. And so they're again bioaccumulating these toxins. Thankfully, because they're not prey limited at this point, it doesn't appear that they're metabolizing these contaminants, and so that they may not be having an impact on their health. However, when they reach carrying capacity, and I expect they will, within all of our lifetimes, this may change. And there's a number of other risks that this population faces from chronic noise in the environment. The Salish Sea in particular is a very noisy environment with the chronic noise of commercial shipping, ferries, transportation, of recreational traffic, commercial whale watch boats, and these all have the potential to negatively impact Bigg's killer whales. Do they negatively impact them? Well, I think a lot of the time they don't. But again, that's because this population is not necessarily prey limited at the moment. But again, these are things we need to be aware of for the future. Military sonar is something we're, always concerned about because we know of the impact that can have on odontocetes. Um, yeah, whether or not it is something that commonly affects Bigg's killer whales, it probably doesn't, but it is something to be mindful of. And I want to take a moment to talk about the impacts of research because as a researcher, I spend a lot of time with Bigg's killer whales, and I definitely see, their reactions to close approaches, prolonged exposure to vessels, and sometimes if you're from a distance watching them from 1 or 200 meters or further, the impact is fairly benign. But when you're trying to get samples or these kinds of things for science, you really have to be mindful of your impact and choose your moments to get what it is you need from these whales, even if it's just a better ID photo. And so this is something that I'm always working on. And some of the more invasive research, like biopsy darting, again, it's just something that I tend to do at specific times. And I want to talk a bit about invasive tagging because this is a population that has received exposure to invasive limpet tags. And I know that there's been some talk about doing this more in the future. So we do thankfully know a bit about the impacts of invasive tagging on this population. And we see a few different signs that these invasive tags leave over time. And if you look up at the top left, this is a stainless attachment pin embedded in the dorsal fin of T86A, which remained there for several years. It's probably still in her dorsal fin now 15 years later. When these tags fall out, and they're designed to fall out with the entire unit exiting the body, but it appears that rarely happens. There's usually quite likely leftover hardware in the dorsal fin. But at least in this case, in the middle image with T99A, you can see a lot of skin loss associated with the tagging event and a lot of raw tissue associated with the exit wound. This healed up quite nicely in the following weeks, but T99A was left with permanent scars, permanent swelling on both sides of the dorsal fin, and then disappeared shortly, just over a year after this tag fell out, at a fairly unusual age to disappear as a large juvenile. Um, T30 here on the right shows discoloration, which can often be associated with infection. Whether or not it was, we don't know, but this was a whale that had a discoloration associated with the tag site for many years following tagging, as well as swelling. You also see on the bottom left as T123A, major skin loss associated with the tagging event and ongoing for several years. And you see skin loss associated with subadult males quite commonly, but it seems to be more severe after a tagging event. And how tagging sites usually heal up over time is you'll see these divots, which really indicate like a fairly well-healed tag site. This is in the center image down at the bottom. And also permanent swelling in the image on the far right. That's T19B, and not very serious swelling compared to T86A or T30 in the top, but fairly minor by comparison. So those are kind of ideal situations, but nevertheless, these whales are left with some minor permanent disfigurement. And when you look at all these cases together, uh, what I should mention first is that this plot shows a number of days on the bottom. And so it's by year. And you'll see that raw tissue typically disappears after 2 years. But having said that, there's several cases where these killer whales have their tag wounds open up again several years later, quite likely because there's tag hardware embedded in their dorsal fins permanently, and their bodies are trying to reject that. And so part of the problem with this is that it creates a pathway for infection. These whales are already contaminated. In some cases, they live in contaminated waters. They seem to be quite healthy for the most part, despite this. But again, this creates a risk of infection. And a risk of infection from the tag site has been known to kill sympatric killer whales from the southern resident killer whale population, one in particular, and perhaps even more killer whales from other populations in different parts of the world. We're not quite sure because we rarely get the bodies back after whales disappear. But you can see that the swelling is typically permanent at the tag site for about 70% of individuals that have been tagged. And swelling is usually associated with chronic inflammation, quite likely pain, and again, quite likely permanently embedded tag hardware. And you can see that skin loss, discoloration, and divots are more commonly associated with about 30% of individuals over the years. So, and most individuals actually have more than one thing going on associated with these tag wounds. And I'm just going to throw it there that we can track killer whales with photo ID for years. These tags, on average, provide 16 days worth of data. Very valuable data, mind you, but 16 days. And so that comes at a very serious cost, which risks the health of these whales and also gives them a lot of pain. And so something to think about when we're supporting different kinds of research on killer whales. Killer whales are also subject to a lot of climate change, and how that's affecting the West Coast transient killer whale population, we're not entirely sure. And it may be more likely that it's more prone to affect different prey species that they rely on, which can then affect them. But we live in a part of the world where climate change is not as obvious as in many other parts of the world. And so I think we're quite lucky in that regard, but it is something that I think we need to be mindful of moving forward. So with all these changes from the way that these killer whales are living their lives, the things they're feeding on, and how the abundance of their prey populations are changing, and the things that they have to deal with in their coexistence with us, whether it's becoming contaminated because they're living in urban environments or being subjected to invasive research or just living in a noisy place. There's a lot of interesting things that big killer whales are doing. And I just want to talk a little bit about them because they're the kinds of things we see in the field and also show up in the photo ID data, which is really interesting to track. One of these things is I think we're seeing some matrolines showing evidence of social reduction. And it may be that certain matrolines of big killer whales have always been introverted, but there's some in this part of the world that just tend to not spend a lot of time with other groups. And this may be related to the fact that they're really invested in a certain resource. And we see this in certain parts of Vancouver Island where some matrolines, like the T55s or the T2Cs, spend a lot of time in a very small part of the coast, not necessarily hanging out with other whales too much. And it may be because they're really relying on a certain prey resource there that isn't large enough to share with other groups. And they're becoming very, expert at exploiting that resource and doing so in a way that's sustainable. So that's something that we might see moving forward, and perhaps even a bit of resource guarding behavior around that, which will be interesting to see if it develops. And I believe that we've already seen those kinds of things throughout the sub-Antarctic, where just certain families are known for taking advantage of certain pinniped rookeries over time. Um, Hand in hand with that, perhaps some groups are more prone to develop specializations when it comes to foraging, and whether this is just foraging in certain areas or actually just on certain species might be interesting to see. We certainly know that certain groups of killer whales tend to hunt dolphins more, for example. That doesn't mean they don't hunt other prey, but they seem to have developed a taste for dolphins, and they've become quite good at it compared to other groups. And with more whales and perhaps less resources in the future, we might see more risk-taking behavior throughout individuals in this population. And over the years, we've certainly seen risk-taking behavior in big killer whales. They spend a lot of time hunting in shallow water environments, but when they're really hungry, they might be more interested in taking those risks. And it's something we've seen with live strandings up and down the coast. And there's actually been one more since we published this paper up in southeastern Alaska. And all of these whales became live stranded because they're hunting harbor seals in shallow water, and the tide went out really quick. And with the exception of this case number one at the bottom, all these whales are still alive. They basically spent a tide cycle out of the water. And then once the tide came back in, they swam away under their own power or had help from people nearby to get back in the ocean. And uh, and so one thing that's interesting is that we don't see offshores or resident killer whales live stranding in the same way that big killer whales do. In fact, the only live strandings that have happened along the west coast of North America in the last few decades have all been big killer whales. Despite the fact that residents often hunt fish close to shore, these big killer whales seem to be more prone to taking the risk to get those seals or sea lions that are in the shallow waters. So one other thing that we might be seeing, at least that the data are showing us, is that these whales have, in some cases, a wide range of social partners, especially when they're turning up in the extremities of their range. And this is a photo that was submitted to Finwave by Jake Pattison up in Haida Gwaii. And it just shows that T120, one of the individuals that likes to hang out on the north coast of British Columbia, is here hanging out with CA23, an individual known from California, also known as T231 when she's in British Columbia. And so maybe that these whales have the opportunity to learn more about different parts of their environment by associating with other whales that like to spend time in different parts of the coast. And hand in hand with that is range expansion. This is another example submitted by Colleen Talty to Finwave of a really well-known killer whale named T65B and her kids, really well-known from British Columbia, Washington, and southeastern Alaska, showed up in Monterey Bay, hanging out with Richie, CA49B, also known as T386 when he's up in British Columbia. And so these are the kinds of things we might continue to see more of. And with these kinds of things, we might see more social interactions. I'm throwing this in here because it's a paper we recently published using photo ID data. A master student of mine and my colleague Paul Tixier's, who did an analysis using scarring. These are conspecific scars caused by the teeth of other killer whales, and we found that big killer whales were the most scarred up between the three populations we tested. We tested Bigg's, northern residents, and crozet killer whales. So we had a mammal specialist population, a fish specialist population, and then a generalist population, which feeds on mammals and fish. And what we found was that the results were very similar amongst sex and age classes between populations, despite the fact that they have very different diets. But we did find that bigs were more scarred up than any others. However, the most interesting thing that came of this is that males were much more scarred up than females in all age classes, but calves and juveniles were more scarred up than anybody in both sexes, highlighting that there is a fair bit of infant or calf-directed aggression in this and other killer whale populations, which tells us a lot about their social society and how things work. And so I think especially when you have a lot of calves being born in a population, in this case T109A2, she's been pumping them out every 2 years, and they've had good survival, which is great. But I think what this leads to is that, especially with the growing population, is that we might see more things like infanticide. This is something that we observed in 2016. And it is perhaps something that's been going on for thousands of years, very rarely. But this kind of risk does help really drive the social structure of the populations that occurs in. And infanticide is something that occurs in many mammal populations, from rodents to primates to carnivores like cheetah or lions or leopards. And it also occurs in bottlenose dolphins and of course killer whales as well. And there's several reasons why it might occur. One is it forces a reproductive female into estrus very quickly. So it provides a mating opportunity for the infanticidal male. It can also remove the progeny of a competing male from the gene pool. And also it can create a meal, and sometimes that might be why it occurs in species like bears, for example. In this case, we saw a adult male and his post-reproductive mother commit infanticide on an unrelated group of individuals. And they didn't eat it, but it may have created a mating opportunity, or it may have just removed the progeny of competing male from the gene pool. But yeah, these are the kinds of rare things, along with infant-directed aggression, which we may continue to see more of as this population grows and and competition becomes more of an issue. We'll see. So exploration is another thing that we see in this population from time to time. And I throw this photo up because these whales are supposed to be preying on mammals and killing mammals only. And here's T64B with a salmon in her mouth. We've seen a few cases come in now of these whales chasing salmon, and it may be more of an exploratory behavior, just interacting with things in their environment, testing the water, so to speak. Um, on that note, you might have heard, it seemed to have gone viral. Some colleagues and I published a paper recently about killer whales in this population and several others around the world attempting to feed people. And this is another example of exploration. And this is something that we see in Bigg's killer whales, probably because they have a very broad diet. They're probably more reliant on adaptability and plasticity than dietary specialists, such as the fish-eating resident killer whales. They're trying to interact with things in their environment so they can better understand them and probably better exploit them. And it seems that other killer whale populations are even more prone to engage in such behavior, like those off of Mexico and those off New Zealand, from which there are several cases of them approaching people in the water and on boats directly, and then letting go of food at very close range in front of people. Not only that, but in 97% of cases, waiting to see what people would do before responding by either swimming away, picking up the item again and offering it again, or picking up the item and then going off and sharing it with their conspecifics. What we found is that even though most killer whales were involved, were part of groups, is that they broke away from groups to engage in this behavior as individuals. We saw that to my surprise, this was a behavior that was undertaken by all sex and age classes. I'd only had this happen to me with juvenile Bigg's killer whales, but by combining all the data, we found that adult females with calves, adult males, juveniles of both sexes, they were all engaged in these fairly rare but widespread events. And perhaps most interestingly, is that play was only involved in 38% of cases. which really highlights that these whales made a conscious decision using their gigantic brains to go ahead and explore what it might be like to engage in reciprocity with people. And so I find that personally fascinating because I don't think there's any other cases of terrestrial animals doing this, for example, especially large terrestrial predators like lions or tigers, or even primates for that matter. It just doesn't happen. Domesticated animals, sure, cats, but you also already have a reciprocal relationship with your pet. Here's a wild animal coming and attempting to feed a human. So very fascinating, which was my sole motivation for writing this paper. Um, on the topic of exploration, we might also see individuals not only expanding their social horizons and their range, but also expanding their range within the same waters they already exist in by going to these nooks and crannies they've never been in before. And I've certainly seen this happen before. This is T49A1 up the river, directly across from where I'm sitting here in Alert Bay, which he swam up at high tide just to have a look around. So fairly risk-taking, risky behavior, considering it's not enough water in the river for him to do that at low tide. But again, as far as risk-taking goes, this is something that can lead to these life-threatening events, such as entrapment. And you may have heard of Brave Little Hunter, a little whale that I was working with last year to try and save from an entrapment situation. And this is something I've done some presentations on as well over the years, not only because of Brave Little Hunter, but because of other cases I've been involved with T51 and T49A2 and T73B and T46C2. These are all whales that have been entrapped from this population. In these cases, in these situations where they just can't seem to get themselves out of. And um, and for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, but they could just swim out the way they swam in. But in some cases, they get into these places, they can't find enough food there, they can't find their way out, and they could eventually die. So we use a few different techniques. I'll just touch upon each of them briefly. Sometimes we use a hukilau to get whales out of these situations. These whales don't really like nets or anything that even resembles a net, so they can swim away from it when it works. Doesn't always work. Boats and okumi pipes can be a bit aggressive, doesn't always work, but it can be quite effective sometimes. Playback experiments, well conducted with the right recording. I've had great success with that, but in the case of Brave Little Hunter, it didn't work. So there's a kind of a toolbox that you have to kind of think about. And with repeated exposures to any of these things, they lose efficacy. So you kind of have to come in with the right one the first time or maybe the second time because it could be the only chance you get. And in all these cases, thankfully, we've had success getting the whales back out into the wild. And most of these whales, if not all of them, are still alive right now, which is great. So with that, I think I'll just say thank you. And if you want to help support the work that Bay Cetology is doing, saving whales when the opportunity arises, or just building up data sets so that we can conduct science and make the data available to other scientists, you can go to our website and you can find ways to support the work that we do there. You can also find us online at the usual places, although we don't really post a lot on social media, but we are on it. And I'll leave it at that. You can contact us at this email address, and I'll hand it back over for any questions.